record as well. There we go. Okay. Well, thank you for taking the time out on a Wednesday evening to come and listen to this talk. Some of you may or may not know who I am. I am son of Margaret and Roy, was member of the club, relapsed member of the club. Isn't that shocking? And so have lived in the kind of the world of cycling for nigh on 40 odd years. And my background, aside from kind of cycling, is that I have been an exercise physiologist for a little over 20 years, which most of that time has been, well, all that time has actually been based at Anglia Ruskin in Cambridge. And I've had the fortune to work with athletes from elite level, so Olympic and Paralympic, all the way down to grassroots in a wide variety of sports, from transatlantic rowers to middle distance and marathon runners to cycling, as we're talking about tonight, even into team sports. And I thought what I would do in this kind of chat, and what I want this to be, is as soon as you want to say something, just you want to ask something, just turn your mic on, rather than me just talking away. If something crops up, just ask the question. Even if it doesn't seem relevant to what I'm talking about, I'm happy to answer questions as we go along. Or if you've got questions you want to save to the end, save them to the end. That's absolutely fine either way. But I thought what would be quite neat to do is to talk a little bit about how we optimize training, both from a kind of an elite perspective right the way down again to more recreationally orientated kind of athletes, but also to think a little bit about the way in which that training and the way in which we regulate that training is a function of where we are in our life journey. And of course, in the club, you've got that incredible group of the sprogs, all the way up to the more senior members. I put that very delicately. The more senior members of the club, all of whom are in essence riding their bikes and trying to either maintain fitness or either trying to prepare for competition and for racing. So I thought what we would kind of do is try and cover all of that, which sounds like quite a lot, but we'll kind of see how we go. And I'm as I say, I tend to talk a little bit freely, and so I will go at tangents and all sorts of things. So I'll be directed, I suppose, to a certain degree by the questions that you guys throw at me. So throw them as you see fit. So we'll start off then with the notion, I suppose, of understanding a little bit about what makes a cyclist and what physiologically are we thinking about when we're training and we're building an athlete. And I use the term building because in many ways, I mean, if you think about the human body is an incredible device. It is the notion of the great machine. It's a computer generated or computer run machine. The computer being the brain and the central nervous system. And it's like any good machine. If you think back to the Industrial Revolution, it's a machine that uses pistons and has an engine and generates energy. And from that energy, we are able to do work. And that work can be in the shape of day-to-day tasks, but in the auspices of what we're talking about here, it is very much in relation to what's happening in terms of cycling. And really, when we're thinking about cycling as a kind of sport, there are these four kind of key components that I'm highlighting here. And I know from some of the kind of the questions that kids said people were interested in, and kind of put a little canvas out, I think, before the event. some of these kind of phrases, particularly this one, cropped up. And these are really these three to this side here, which is how economical you are, the lactate turn point, which I'll describe that in more detail in a moment, and the Vo2 Max. I like to describe them as the holy trinity of sport, or the holy trinity, I suppose, of endurance performance. Because the analogy you want to think a little bit about is, think about kind of cars. And I mean, I don't drive, so it's a really bad example for me to use. I mean, it'd be terrible if I was driving, but I don't drive. But I often watch programs like Top Gear. And in Top Gear, they talk about, particularly when Jeremy Clarkson was on it, he always talk about three things. He used to talk about top speed, and he used to be, fascinated by how fast a car could go. He used to be interested in the how big the fuel tank was. So how much fuel could you get in this car? And then they often talked about the idea of how economical a car is, the miles per gallon. And actually, in terms of athletes and in terms of sporting performance, that very much is akin to what we see. So we've got economy here, which is the miles per gallon that we can get out of the fuel that we're using, which I'll come back to in a moment. We've got the lactate turn point, which is very much the size of the fuel tank. And then we've got the kind of the top end speed. Now, the best way to think about this isn't your fastest possible speed. This isn't kind of sprinting for the cafe on a Saturday morning or whatever it is. This is kind of your highest, the highest work rate that you can sustain or manage using cardiorespiratory fitness. So it's what we call aerobic based energy. It's the energy which is oxygen dependent. If you're thinking about really top end speed and you want to keep the car analogy going, I often think about that as being kind of having a fuel injector in the car. Okay, so that's when you get into the sprint speed stuff. And so these really describe endurance. And so if you imagine the ultimate car, and the ultimate car, if you're thinking of it in terms of kind of performance, is a car that's got the highest speed. It can carry as much fuel as possible, and it burns the fuel as efficiently as possible. So it gets great miles per gallon out of the car. And I suppose in terms of the car industry, this is kind of what everybody is trying to achieve. And athletically, that is very much what we're trying to achieve. I mean, the ultimate athlete has a big Vo2 max, which I'll explain what these are physiologically in a moment. We'll have a big Vo2 max. That's kind of what I refer to as the engine. They will have a big fuel tank. So that's this reserve, this, how big is the capacity to do work. And they will basically be using less energy than their counterparts. So these become the kind of the holy trinity in terms of endurance. The kind of the fourth wall is this component here, which I won't focus on for a moment. I'm going to come back to this in about 20 minutes. But this is the notion of what is called critical power, which is another component. It's a misunderstood component. It's something that's not really referred to very often. But I think you'll see how relevant that is. But underneath all of these, really these are kind of the limiting factors in terms of what happens athletically. So if we think about cycling, particularly if we're thinking about racing as an example, so I'm going to go to the racing extreme, then predominantly the energy that you use is carbohydrate, CHO. And so use the carbohydrate because in terms of the amount of energy you get the greatest bang for your buck using carbohydrate. If you burn fats, which everybody talks about the notion of trying to metabolize fat to either lose weight or whatever, if you burn fats, you actually do burn and actually get more energy from a molecule of fat than you do from a molecule of carbohydrate. The downside is it takes an awful lot longer to get hold of that energy. It's a much, much slower process. So actually, athletically, you get a bigger bang for your buck from carbs than you will from fats. But the issue that we face, really, particularly athletically, is that as we do work, and you know, the way to think about it is that you've got your muscles, and your muscles are lengthening and shortening, and they're kind of lengthening and shortening. And to do that lengthening and shortening, so that is, for example, to pedal or whatever it is, we have to use stored energy, and we're using the carbohydrate to basically resynthesize this stored energy. To get the energy from it, what we do is we split the molecule. It's all very kind of technical. We split the molecule, but the end product of that is you produce energy, which part of that is in the form of heat. And the process is actually terribly inefficient. I often think and joke that, you know, if the government knew how inefficient it was, they would tax us on the amount of heat that we produce. Because every time we split one of these energy molecules, 75% of it is lost in the form of heat. Terribly inefficient. And so what starts to happen is, as you start to do more work, that is, you maybe have to pedal faster, or you have to push harder because you're going up Tom Hill, and you're groveling on somebody's wheel going up Tom Hill, and you're having to push on the pedals harder, because your muscles are doing more work, you generate more heat. And so one of the big limiting factors that we have in terms of athletic performance is how much heat can we generate, and how quickly can we get rid of that heat? And that is very much a function of how economical we are. So if we use less energy for the same workload, we generate less heat. And then we've got these two, which are kind of very much linked together. I've been kind of talking so far about the idea of working, I suppose, aerobically, which is conventionally what we think about in terms of endurance. But we also were able to generate our energy when we cycle and do any exercise anaerobically. That is using metabolic pathways that are oxygen independent, and very, very useful, because we get our energy far more quickly from those pathways, much, much more quickly than we do aerobically. But the downside is that we have a finite amount of energy that we can generate anaerobically, and we have a finite capacity to do that. And so once you've used up that capacity, that it's gone. And so this is a real issue that we have, again, when we're maybe out on a club run or racing, is as soon as we go beyond this point here, which I'll show you in a moment, we go beyond this lactate turn point, we start to rely more on anaerobic energy. And as we do that, we're basically, it's like taking out a bank loan. And the further you go beyond this point here, the more you borrow from the anaerobic bank. And like any good bank, at some point you're going to have to pay that back. And once it's gone during exercise. And the issue that you face is every time you want to, I don't know, you want to attack in a race, or you want to push very hard up the hill, or you're sprinting, as I say, you know, for Aston Cantlow or something, you're doing the sprint, you are going to borrow anaerobic energy, and that capacity slowly diminishes. It starts to decrease. And once you've kind of used that energy up during exercise, it's gone. And the only way we can get it back is by slowing down. And then the final thing is the rate of what's called metabolic accumulation. And at this point, I suppose, the thing I'm going to say, which I don't know whether it will shock you or not shock you, I suppose, but is everybody often talks about the rate of what we call lactate accumulation. We mentioned lactate here. And everybody will make this statement, say, well, you know, lactate causes fatigue. Okay, and you read this all the time. And lactate causes fatigue. Let me be absolutely clear. Lactate doesn't cause fatigue. Lactate is not a fatigue-inducing metabolite. In fact, lactate is really good. You know, I think we've got this idea that lactate is really bad. Without lactate, you would not be able to sustain exercise at all. And actually, all lactate really is carbohydrate. That's all it is. It's just carbohydrate that's been broken down. So don't be frightened of lactate, and don't be concerned when you read all these reports in Cycling Weekly in the RAG mag. You read all this stuff about lactate this and lactate that. Lactate's not causing the fatigue. Fatigue is caused by other metabolites that are produced as a result, partly of using up this energy, and partly because you're generating heat, and partly because you're burning carbohydrates. So all these things kind of go together to help us produce this kind of endurance athlete. Now, the one thing, and don't kind of worry about all the lines that are running down here, is, well, what is the Vo2 Max, which was the one aspect of this? And quite simply, your Vo2 Max just refers to what symbolically what it means. It's the maximum volume of oxygen, so the Vo2 Max, the maximum volume of oxygen that you can in essence use aerobically. And we physiologically know what this represents. It represents your heart rate, so it's your maximal heart rate times the maximum amount of blood that you can get through the heart per beat. And I'm going to show you why that's so fundamentally important to just being recreational cyclists in a moment. And those are multiplied by something which is very, very cool. I get very excited about measuring this in the lab. And this is basically the amount of oxygen that we extract at the muscle. So A is for arterial and V is for venous. And so if you've got a high Vo2 max, what that will generally mean is that you've actually, ironically, got a low heart rate, but a very, very high stroke volume. So you have a huge capacity to eject blood per beat of the heart. And Vo2 max is really important because it describes your upper ceiling for aerobic fitness. It's this marker of cardiorespiratory fitness. Now, what I will say is that Vo2 max is not a performance indicator. So one of the things that's often bandied around, and it's quite an old school of thought, is that if you've got a high Vo2 max, you are going to be a really good endurance athlete. It's not the case. What we know is having a reasonably large Vo2 max is fundamentally important. But I go back to the Holy Trinity. You've got to have that combination of the max, the lactate turn point, and the economy to be a good, good's a loose term, but be a decent endurance athlete. Just on here, just to give you an example, it just gives you a measure of all these factors that we've got listed here contribute to the Vo2 max. And you can see that some of these will actually respond quite quickly to training. So you get changes in capillary density in the muscle and so on. And some are kind of what we call an acute response, and then you get some which are more chronic long-term based responses. But don't be surprised that that your Vo2 max, if you're kind of new to cycling or you're new to perhaps cycle training, your Vo2 max can actually be shifted in as little as 6 sessions. So if you start from kind of zero, we've got data that shows we can increase Vo2 max significantly within 6 sessions of training. The issue that you've got is twofold. One, like anything, as that Vo2 max gets bigger, the gains become smaller. It's the classic Team GB thing, which is marginal gains. The gains become smaller. And then secondly, what we're going to get onto in a moment is that as we get beyond certain age points, the Vo2 max starts to decline. So actually what we find is that we start to lose the upper ceiling for aerobic fitness. And so then what we get into is that whole idea of trying to maintain that fitness and trying to slow the decline down. But as I say, this is kind of your upper ceiling. So this is part of the Holy Trinity. The second part of the Holy Trinity is what I mentioned, which is the lactate turn point. So again, as kind of a little reminder, remember I said this was kind of the fuel tank part of it. And what we've got here is this is some data that we collected from our labs. Actually collected this not too long ago. And what we've done is we've had a cyclist do what we call an incremental exercise test. It's really simple. They just basically cycle for 3 minutes at each of these wattages that you see at the bottom. And at the end of each wattage, we take a blood lactate sample. And the lactate is telling us how much the anaerobic energy is contributing to the exercise. And so what you can see is that at these low wattages down here, blood lactate doesn't really rise. It goes up, but if you look at the values, it's gone up from 1 to about 3 millimole. It's not a big rise across this period here. And then suddenly it goes boom, straight up, and then it just keeps rising. And where you get this kind of sudden change, it's what we call a kind of a deflection point here, is this notion of the lactate turn point. And it merely symbolizes for us this transition from predominantly aerobic, kind of classic endurance-based training to more anaerobically orientated, not completely, because we're still below VO2 max, but there's a greater reliance on anaerobic energy up here. So this point is telling us how big this area is here. This is your aerobic kind of fuel tank. Because if you work in anywhere in this zone here, you'll notice that there is very little lactate accumulation. So there's very little anaerobic contribution. So the work in this zone is really, really highly sustainable work. You can actually, you could quite comfortably cycle for 6, 7, 8 hours in that zone, as long as you're kind of, you know, fueling the body. You can sustain exercise really, really easily in this zone that we've got here. But once we go beyond this lactate turn point here, what starts to happen is you see the lactate rises, and the reason it rises is, I've symbolized it here, but you start to recruit less efficient muscles. The muscle fibers which are kind of fast to twitch, your heart rate carries on rising, and you start to become more fatigued. This is kind of indicating fatigue for you. And if you exercise in this zone here, what we find is that you're predominantly able to do what we call steady state training. So what we mean by steady state training is it's that classic long mileage based training. And so what ideally we want is this point here to occur, excuse me, to occur as a higher percentage of the VO2 max as possible. Because that means it's like having more gears on your bike. At the moment, this athlete has got, well, let's see what we've got. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 gears. So that's 6 what I call classic steady state endurance-based gears. And then we've got the VO2 max here. But if he was able to shift the VO2 max to hit, no, sorry, the lactate turn point to here, we'd have an extra gear. So it's kind of showing you what the kind of the aerobic gear range is that you've got. So it's a really important point to us. And again, it's part of that holy trinity of endurance. I'll come back to that in a moment. This is kind of a data set, and I apologize that it perhaps feels like Physiology 101 or it's, you know, it's very graphy or whatever. It's very difficult to think how to kind of put this into context, but this is some data we published a couple of years ago, which I still think is beautiful. And what we did is we had quite elite cyclists into the lab, and we had them doing the same test you just saw, exercise tests to exhaustion. And we measured a shed load of parameters. That's what I love doing that. I love just throwing electrodes on people and measuring everything. It's great. And we had them doing this. It doesn't really matter, but we had them, the 2 lines represent doing this on an aerodynamic position with tri-bars and doing it in a non-aerodynamic position. And that's kind of by the by. But the important thing to note is here's the kind of what we were looking at, the kind of the blood lactate response here. But the data that's quite interesting is if you kind of look at the other plot, so you've got here the heart rate, notice that your heart rate goes up in a straight line, it's linear. And so this is really important. So what this is telling us is that there is actually a kind of biological mismatch between what is going on in terms of heart rate and what is going on in terms of lactate. And one of the take-home messages I would say to you is, if you are using a heart rate monitor, be very careful about what the heart rate monitor is showing you, because heart rate is only really relevant for any work that is being carried out below that lactate turn point I was talking about earlier on. So it's only really relevant if you're working down here. Because as soon as you go beyond that point and the blood lactate starts to rise, that's showing a curvilinear response. So you can see that rise, heart rate carries going on in a straight line. So your heart rate is no longer telling you what is going on in terms of the machine at the pistons that are driving the bike. So heart rate is really useful if we're in this kind of steady endurance zone. But as soon as you kind of think about intervals, or you think about kind of more intense training, your heart rate dissociates away from what is actually going on biologically at the muscle at that point. Okay, right. So I wanted to just emphasize that a little bit more for you, just to kind of show you, which I think you'll find is really interesting, but I hope you do, is here's that blood lactate data I was showing you a moment ago, and the yellow zone is our nice steady training zone. And here is what we've measured at the muscle. So this is actually what's happening in terms of the amount of oxygen that's being consumed at the muscle. And so what this tells you is it's exactly what we suspected, or what I was suggesting to you, which is if you want to do training that is going to really develop kind of what we call endurance base, so base kind of training, it's in here. If you are looking to develop responses which are more to do with local muscular adaptation, so in other words, you're trying to generate adaptations in the muscle, look what happens. As soon as you go beyond that lactate turn point, which is this point here, we start to try and suck more oxygen out per beat of the heart because the muscle is under more stress. So in other words, training down here doesn't really produce any local muscle adaptation, but it will produce central, what we call cardiovascular adaptation, which I'll show you in a moment. And so this is one of the things we have to think about with training is, you know, yeah, we can go and train and we can go and cycle and it's great. And actually doing any exercise is better than doing no exercise. But if you're trying to get into the kind of thinking about structuring training, then you've got to be careful in terms of, you don't want to waste the training. You don't want to waste your time, particularly if it's the kind of in the winter and you've been on a turbo, or, you know, you've been doing all this you know, these kind of Zwift training sessions. Down here, the muscle is under no real stress. We can see that because it's not extracting any more oxygen. We can see that because the lactate's not rising. So the only thing that's really happening is that the heart is just beating away and there's blood pumping into the heart. And so the adaptations are occurring predominantly at the heart. When we get up here, the adaptations are more within the muscle and are more associated, with the ability to generate power at the muscle. And so it allows us to kind of separate quite simply what's going on in terms of central, heart, maybe to do with lungs, although lungs is an interesting one, heart, lungs, and so on, and then at the muscle. I say the lungs is an interesting one because your lungs do not respond to training. You can't increase your lung capacity. You can enhance your lung efficiency, so you can enhance the rate at which the air is moved in and out of the lung, but you can't change your lung capacity. So if you've got a small lung capacity, you're kind of biologically screwed in terms of endurance. If you've got a large lung capacity, it automatically puts you at a natural advantage compared to most other people. Now, I'll take a stop in a moment for if there's any questions people want to ask at this point, but I just thought I'd show you this because this really, to me, summarizes a lot of what you perhaps want to think about in terms of training. And it may also tie into, I think, some of the questions I've heard, I saw that were kind of being offered in relation to, you know, what happens, for example, if I've had, you know, heart surgery, I've got a pacemaker or whatever. So the graph here on the left is showing us the kind of the heart rate response that I talked about earlier on. And look how it's as straight as a die. It's just absolutely straight up. So the exercise intensity goes up, heart rate follows that response. But this is really interesting. So this is the stroke volume. So this is the volume of blood per beat of the heart. And so this is really fascinating, because notice what's happening, that despite the fact the exercise intensity is increasing, the volume of blood that is being ejected per beat of the heart beyond about 225 watts here no longer rises. It levels out. So we've reached kind of a peak in terms of the volume of blood that can be ejected per beat of the heart. Well, why is that important? Well, if you're trying to do training, which is what I call aerobic base training, which is building the foundation, so I'll show you in a moment with my pyramid, there's no point doing it up here, because you're not getting any more gains in terms of the stress you're putting on the heart, in terms of trying to get an adaptation to the heart, than you would be if you were training here, because the volume of blood going through the heart isn't any different. All you're actually doing is putting the heart under more kind of stress, because it's beating faster and faster and faster. But actually, in terms of trying to get an adaptation to the heart, no point training up here. You want to be down here, because actually you'll get, because the intensity is lower, it's more sustainable. You try and train up here and thinking you're getting kind of good cardiorespiratory fitness, you're kind of not, you're not getting it. You're actually going to run out of energy pretty quick up here. And yet it sounds counterintuitive, but in terms of getting those heart-based adaptations, you can see that it's just starting to level out, and we can train at the fixed heart rate. Sorry, that's my dog whinging in the background. You can train at the fixed heart rate. And so what you've got is, you've got kind of a recognition that that is the case. Well, how do you know that that's going to be the case in you guys? You haven't come and done a lab test. You know, you can more than welcome to come and do a lab test, but you haven't done a lab test. How do you know? Well, what we know is that in most people, and I say most people, there is a couple of groups who this doesn't apply to, and that is the highly elite, you know, the super highly trained, like, you know, the Guy Elliots of this world. But the highly elite athletes, this doesn't apply. But if we take kind of everybody else, so I'm talking about, you know, even well-trained racers, your stroke volume levels out at about 50% to 60% of your VO2 max. So we know that occurs in everybody, and you're going, well, hold on, Dan, how do I know my VO2 max? Well, there's a very simple way that you could estimate your VO2 max. Very, very simple way. What you would need to do is do a test, set a test up on a turbo or on, you know, a similar device. And most of you have now probably got access to something that shows you power, I would suspect. And all you do is you basically just do a test where you increase the power every minute, and you increase it as, you know, roughly the similar increments that you're seeing here, 20 to 30 watts. And every minute you just increase it. And at some point you're going to blow up, right? At some point the wheels are literally, metaphorically, going to come off. At that point, obviously the test stops. And what you do is you look at the last workload you could sustain for a whole minute, That is pretty much going to be your VO2 max. So if you know what workload that was, you can work backwards from that workload and say, okay, well, I've stopped at, you know, 300 watts. Okay, so Dan's saying 50 to 60%. So 150 to about 160 watts. And you know, you could work out, you could see what your heart rates were during your test. You could suddenly work out where you need to be to get the best out of that kind of response. And even if you're on the club run, you can obviously manipulate that, because you can just adjust your gearing to make sure that your heart rate is at that zone, and that the wattage is at that zone, so that you're not blowing the stroke volume really high, and you're getting the kind of the adaptations that you're looking for. Okay, I'll pause if there's any kind of burning questions that people have got at this point, before we kind of get into the next part. So if anybody's got a question, just shout them out. Otherwise, I will carry on.
Yeah, Dan, it's Gary RP.
How you doing?
Coaches often talk about lactate threshold heart rate.
Yes.
You've not mentioned that yet. Does that roughly equate to the lactate turn point?
It absolutely does. So one of the things that gets really confusing about this is the terminology. And the science is really bad. So you'll notice we've got 2 points. You've actually got a lactate threshold here and a lactate turn point here. So the turn point is what most coaches refer to as threshold, but actually this is threshold down here, just to really confuse people. But your point is right. So they talk about a heart rate at this point here. And so what this tells us is this is kind of the upper heart rate for this aerobic base training zone. And then what you'll observe actually is that the heart rate rise between this point here and this point here, which we call critical power. The heart rate rise is only about a 5 or 6 beat rise. It's really small. And so this is a really kind of small little training zone, which actually has its own kind of merits. But yes, you would have a heart rate which is technically associated with that transition point from the base training to the more, dare I say, anaerobically orientated training. Does that make sense?
Yep, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Anybody else before we crack on?
May I ask a question? Can I put my video on?
Of course you can. Yeah.
Oh, you've stopped it, so you can't see me. It says the
That's
host
right.
has stopped me. How accurate are these Garmin Vo2 Max estimations? I get one off my Garmin.
Yes, and I've got to be slightly careful. They are not very accurate. They are based upon, very clever algorithms, but they're only as accurate as the conditions which they're being measured under.
Yeah, I just use it as a trend. So if I can see the trend rising, then something's going right. So
yeah, I mean, the best way to think about it would be, if I wanted to know my Vo2 max and I wanted to know it and get a good estimation of it, what I would say is you would go and ride for fairly hard for 4 minutes and see what the Garmin tells you and use that as a benchmark. And then you go away and you do whatever your training is, or you go on your club runs and you go and reevaluate it again, and you can see whether that has shifted. If what you're doing is getting the data and your watch is showing you your Vo2 max in a training session, it's not a very accurate measurement, and it's kind of very much dependent upon your heart rate. So that's what's driving that measurement. And the downside with heart rate is that heart rate is both a biological and an emotional variable. So we all know that when we get stressed, our heart rate goes up. Now, stress comes in a number of forms, both physical and emotional. So if you happen to be quite stressed, your heart rate will go up and it will estimate that your Vo2 max has gone up. So it becomes quite a cumbersome measurement. They are getting better. They're far better than they used to be. They are getting better. It will give you a benchmark. But I think, if I'm looking for a benchmark, what I would always say in anything is try and make it so that you can repeat it, so it's replicable. So you've got a frame of reference each time to compare against.
thank you.
That's all right. Anybody else?
That's useful, thank you.
No? Well, I'll carry on, and if questions do pop into your mind, just throw them in. So at the moment, we've been talking about everything which is to do with, I suppose, more conventional based endurance and training within this kind of steady zone down here. But the area that's receiving a lot of interest, of course, at the moment in the media is this idea of doing interval based training, and it's been given a really newfangled term, which is, of course, everybody talks about HIIT based training. And HIIT, as I say, is not new, it's just intervals. But what I thought I would do is just kind of set it out for you a little bit in terms of the way the intervals are, in essence, or could be, constructed in terms of the intensity. So I'm just going to drop my intensity lines on. And what you'll see is that the HIIT, the classic, what we refer to HIIT, is down here. And actually, it's at around about 90% Vo2 max, up to Vo2 max. So this is the classic, what we call Vo2 Max training. And so we talked about doing the training which is in that steady zone to promote the adaptation in terms of the heart. But when I showed you the Vo2 Max schematic earlier on, and it got all the arrows going everywhere, there was a lot of things that contribute to it. And things like the capillaries and the kind of the what are called the mitochondria, which in the cell, everything which is in the muscle, which is fundamental to the Vo2 Max, doesn't get developed when you're training in those lower intensities. So you have to train at these higher intensities to achieve this. But here's a thing about kind of Vo2 Max intervals. And again, I apologize, I'm going to show you a graph, but I'm also apologizing is that I'm actually going to draw this graph. My graphs, as my students tell me, are terrible. But if you imagine that this graph that I'm just plotting here in the middle is going to have on the, this axis, which is, I'm just going to highlight it. So this axis here, I'm just going to show you oxygen uptake, and this is just going to be against time. And what happens is, as if you put somebody on at a workload around 90% Vo2 max to Vo2 max, what happens is what we would see, even if somebody was at low intensity exercise, is that the Vo2 kind of does, let me make sure I'm doing it in a thin enough line so I don't feel like I'm a muppet, but the Vo2 does this. Oh, I knew I was going to do it wrong, but it does this. It doesn't rise instantly. So it actually takes time for the Vo2 to rise. You've started the workload here, but the amount of oxygen that you're using takes time to rise. Your heart rate takes time to rise. The metabolic rate takes time to rise. So, why is that relevant? Well, what it tells us is that actually this time to rise to this point here, with this kind of riser here, this point here, it actually takes about 3 to 4 minutes to reach that point. So what that means is if you're looking at setting intervals, which are intervals to train Vo2 max, the minimum duration has got to be in excess of 3 minutes. Because if all you've done is a 3-minute interval, you've never got to Vo2 max. You have to be at Vo2 max to train the Vo2 max, that element of the Vo2 max that I'm talking about. So we tend to look at intervals which are 4 minutes upwards. These are horrible. I mean, they're not pretty intervals, they are pretty gruesome intervals. But if you're trying to train the Vo2 max and you're training at that kind of workload, you've got to kind of follow the laws of physiology, which says, well, I've got to get to Vo2 max to develop the Vo2 max. So it fundamentally, the duration of the interval becomes very, very important to us. Now, oh, look at that. It's done a really fancy line. How have I just done that? Let me get rid of that. Right, let's clear all drawings. Right, so if we think about the adaptations that are occurring, what we see is that this is kind of the way that they work. At the lower intensities, they're more central, and as the intensity goes up, they become more muscular based. And so as you start to get into high intensity, really high intensity intervals, so if you've ever been to a gym and they've talked about doing what's called Tabata training, which is, horrible, right? It's 20-second sprints with a 10-second recovery. It's flat out, 20 seconds flat out. You're kind of up this neck of the woods here. And so what that means is there's no time for the heart rate to rise. There's no time for the stroke volume to rise. There's no time for you to really deliver vast amounts of oxygen to the muscle. So all of the kind of the work is taking place at the muscle. So the intervals, if you're doing really fast intervals, are not going to develop cardiorespiratory fitness. They're going to develop local muscular fitness. And I get terribly, terribly frustrated. I've published quite a few studies on this now with people who will argue, well, if you do intervals, do HIIT, it increases your cardiorespiratory fitness. What a crock of rubbish. It just can't. You've got to, if you think about it very logically, to get something to adapt, you've got to put it under stress. You're not getting the heart under enough stress at these high intensity intervals for the heart to increase its size, for the volume of blood to go through the heart. But what you are doing is getting local adaptations to the muscle. So it will contribute to your fitness, but it is not what's really going to contribute to your Vo2 max. But if you're thinking about training that we talk about things like lactate tolerance, yeah, this is where you need to be to do lactate tolerance. When I was competing, it was the training that I loved and hated the most. You know, lactate tolerance was we would do 30 seconds in the highest gear we could push, flat out, and then we would have 30 seconds recovery, and we would do 8 of these, and then we'd have a 40-minute rest and do 8 more. And the guy I used to race with on the tandem, Barney, I would routinely see Barney with his head down a drain, because we do these outdoors and there's be throwing up everywhere, because it's horrible. But we were trying to develop these kind of power in the muscle adaptations rather than these kind of cardiovascular adaptations. So I think it's kind of a really important message that I think we think that HIIT is this new panacea of training and it's going to solve everything. I'll show you in a moment that it solves almost nothing. I'm conscious of kind of time, so I'm going to try and get into the next bit, which is a little bit about kind of the lifespan stuff. So that's kind of about training, and it's very much a whistle-stop tour. But what we've got to recognize is that we are we are failing machines, I'm afraid, and that really once we kind of we get through adolescence and we reach kind of the late teens, the early 20s, we are by definition starting to fall apart, and it's a very, very sad state of affairs, and we start to lose a lot of the key biological factors that are fundamental to us in terms of cycling. We start to lose muscle mass, and that actually comes on quite a lot later in life. We actually start to get what's called a sarcopenia into our 60s. So really, we don't lose massive amounts of muscle mass until later on. What we do lose quite early on in our late 20s is the ability to recruit that muscle mass. That becomes harder and harder. Because you start to lose muscle mass, you start to lose muscle strength as you get older. And so these two go together. And so you suddenly think, well, actually, hold on, if I'm trying to generate power through the crank, then that actually is fundamentally linked to strength. If you think what strength is, or sorry, you think what power is basically strength over time. So it's the amount of work the muscle can do, how quickly you can do it. And so when you're trying to push power through the crank, if you are losing muscle mass, you by definition are losing muscle strength. And if you're losing strength, what we start to see is a reduction in power. And so the power starts to decline. The flip side is we start to get an increase in fat mass, and we start to lay down greater amounts of adipose tissue as we start to get older. And I go back to the economy I was talking about earlier on. As you start to increase the amount of fat tissue, then what that basically means is that you're carrying more dead weight, which means you become less economical. You use more oxygen to do the same amount of work. And of course, we become more susceptible to inflammation and kind of illness. We've all been living through this, this global pandemic, and it perhaps should come as no surprise that the population that hit the hardest are the older generation, because they're more susceptible to inflammation. But it's worth bearing in mind on the inflammatory response. There was something really interesting that I thought just worth showing you very, very briefly, which is, and again, I apologize, I'm going to draw one of my really terrible graphs for you. But if I just draw this very quick graph here, and what we know is if you take the axis, which is kind of the vertical axis, I'm just going to use this as going from 0 down here to here, up to here, which is kind of 100%. So it's kind of a risk. We're going to use this kind of risk. And what we know is if we kind of look at the susceptibility to illness and infection, and we map it across untrained to moderately well-trained to highly elite, what we see is this, that the untrained individuals, I'm just going to find a marker to show you it with, the untrained individuals are kind of up here. The moderately well-trained, which is where I'd put, the majority of you guys in the club are, you're out, you're training, you're riding, you're down here. Your susceptibility to illness and infection is greatly reduced. But as soon as you start being moved to be highly trained, you're up here. You become far more susceptible to illness and infection, and we get what's called Niemann-J, which is that response there. And so we have this kind of two-pronged issue, which is as we become older, we become more susceptible, And as you know, if we're an older masters-based athlete, it's kind of like a double whammy. The age causes the increased susceptibility, as does the fact that we are, you know, technically highly trained as well. So we're kind of in that position of trying to overcome all of these and trying to find ways in which we can reduce these kind of effects. And so one of the big ways of reducing, of thinking about this is you can't prevent this. You can't prevent, you know, the passage of time, but you can slow these down. And you're all, you know, classically doing it the obvious way, which is through exercise. Exercise slows the decay in muscle mass. So any work that you put through the muscle, anytime you put tension on the muscle, it has a positive effect. Anytime that you are in essence pedaling at a higher cadence, what that's doing is increasing neural recruitment. Or no, I'll rephrase that. That's a bad phrase, DJ. What it's doing is it is in essence optimizing neural recruitment. So the muscles are basically recruited through the central nervous system. So if you actually do try and pedal at a faster rate, actually what that is doing is it's trying to maintain that connection between the central nervous system and the muscle. And it's going to prevent that kind of loss of functionality, or the decay and the loss of functionality that we see over time. So oddly, training with higher cadences is actually quite beneficial, particularly as we get older, because it starts to kind of delay that kind of inevitable creep that we get as we kind of get older. These are also kind of key factors that we start to see reductions in things like cardiovascular fitness. So you know, our peak cardiovascular fitness occurs quite early on, and then it's a gradual decline. In terms of VO2 max, which is kind of the big one that I talked about earlier on, we actually start to see about a 1% decline beyond the age of 21 for every decade. So it's a 1% decline beyond the age of 21 if we haven't done any training. We can delay that through training. So again, training that is going to optimize cardiorespiratory fitness is going to be beneficial in delaying that kind of fall in the VO2 max. And it's not particularly rocket science. You know, it sounds pretty obvious, but if you put something under stress, it's going to, in essence, be a way of preventing that from declining. I thought I would just show you this because this is really neat. So this is a slide from a muscle biopsy. And what you've got on the left here, this is the biopsy from a young male. And so this is what we call these are labels. These are the fast twitch fibers that you can see here. The fast twitch fibers are always the lighter colored fibers. And you can see this fiber, it's got a big area. Now, this is from a 70-year-old male. And you can see that what happens is that the fibers that we use to generate force, the ones that enable us to produce force, we start to get this reduction in their size. And so we start to lose muscle mass as we get older. I mean, you look at the kind of the size differential there. Now with training, you're not going to prevent this loss. You're just going to slow that rate of decay down. But that is unfortunately kind of an inevitable effect of training that we kind of all experience. But I thought it was really neat kind of seeing it under the electron microscope. I love these kind of slides. The flip end of this, which is children. And I thought it'd be quite useful just to show you this because, of course, you've got a large number of children in the club, and you've got a fantastic reputation for working with kids on, you know, the pre-COVID on the Monday nights down at the circuit in Tudor Grange and all sorts of other things. But the one thing I would say to any of the coaches that are here, which, you know, again, I don't want to teach us suck eggs, but it's amazing how many times you see this happening, is children are not small adults. And so we cannot train children in the same way that we train adults. And we have to recognize that children actually respond to training differently. One of the issues we have with children is that children are like sponges. So you can actually throw huge amounts of training at children and they will absorb it. And they could do it. You know, you could get kids and you could expose them to the kind of training that an adult's doing and they would do it. And they would probably never question it. But what you're actually doing is you're leading them to kind of, you know, to failure. It leads to chronic conditions like overtraining syndrome, where you really can break a child very, very easily by just exposing them to too much training. And it's a twofold thing. It's too much, which is volume, and it's too intense. So what you have to think about with children is that actually smaller amounts, but actually probably more often is more beneficial than larger amounts less often. What I just thought I'd show you this, it's a fairly old data set, but it's just to show you that there are key windows with children when they're actually susceptible biologically. And these are very kind of rudimentary measures that the group have used, but they're showing you this PHV is when they get the growth spurt. It's what we call peak height velocity. And so you can see that things like, this is a measure of strength, bent arm hang, sit and reach is flexibility, plate tapping is kind of coordination. The ones up here, arm pull again is kind of a slightly different strength measurement. Vertical jump is power. And the shuttle run is kind of our measure of kind of endurance. And what you can see is that some of these, like the kind of the endurance, is actually reaching its kind of peak, their susceptibility to it, actually before they reach the peak height velocity, and then it actually climbs again. So one of the things you have to be slightly careful of with kids is as they go through the growth spurt, it has massive ramifications on the way in which they adapt to training. And so what I would implore you to perhaps try and think about is that as you see, and we do see it, we see it happen quite quickly. Suddenly they've changed quite quickly. Just think a little bit about their susceptibility. They will lose coordination. You can see what happens here. Look at the coordination. So don't be surprised that when they hit the growth spurt, that they have poor handling skills on the bike. Because what's happening is that although their skeletal architecture is increasing, their height is increasing, and so on, their central nervous system hasn't caught up. The nerves are incredibly being stretched. They're not actually able to recruit the muscles as effectively as possible, so their coordination is reduced. So it's little things like that to perhaps be wary of, particularly when working with children. Again, I'm conscious of kind of time here, so I'm going to desperately try and keep to roughly an hour and then throw it over to questions. The other thing is just thinking a little bit about children with energy. Don't worry about kind of the terms, but all I'll say is this here is kind of carbohydrate, and these are the energy that we use if we're sprinting, these top two here. But look, kids have actually got less of these energy sources, and the rate at which they can use carbohydrates is much less during exercise. They're less efficient. So again, one of the things to remember with children is that they will appear to, fatigue much more quickly than an adult. They're less efficient for kind of the same amount of work. They've got less energy available. They're less efficient. It also means they will need longer to recover between training sessions because they've got less of this energy. And because their rate of utilization is less in terms of the rate at which they use the energy is less, they are more susceptible to fatigue, and therefore they will need longer to recover between sessions. Okay. Again, I just thought I'd quickly show you this. I love these kind of things. They're always quite nice to show. Again, we're just showing here the development, and this is brilliant. This is, again, data from muscle biopsies from 8 months to 5 years to 14 years to adult. And you can just see the change in the size of these muscle fibers. And even, at 14 years of age, although they've gone through that kind of growth spurt, they've still got an increase in muscle architecture size to come. They're going to get stronger. So again, it's worth thinking about when we're training children. Can we train strength when they're young? Yes, you absolutely can. Don't be frightened of the idea that children can't do strength training. They absolutely can. But you just don't train them like an adult. You can train them at the same relative percent, same percentage of their kind of maximum lift, but you can't train them using the same number of sets that you would do with an adult. If you've got them on the bike, you can train them at the kind of the same relative wattage as the adult, but they would just do less sets. They would just do less amount of work. So you just factor everything down for the child as opposed to what you would do with the adult. Okay. So the last thing I want to show you is what I call pyramids, icebergs, and Rubik's cubes. And I was slightly concerned if there's going to be any younger members of the club in the session tonight who will be going, what the heck's a Rubik's cube? I grew up with Rubik's cubes. I was a huge fan of Rubik's cubes. I was terrible at them. My brother was brilliant at Rubik's cubes. I was terrible. But why am I showing you these? Well, these are something I've kind of I've I've patented in terms of kind of the work, and I published these in a book a few years ago, because I think if you're trying to describe to somebody about training and you're trying to describe to somebody about what works and doesn't work, I think you've got to think about pyramids, icebergs, and Rubik's cubes. And the first thing is Rubik's cubes. There's a classic Rubik's cube. And when you think about somebody's physiology, we kind of compartmentalize it. So what I've done here is that this was kind of for my students when I showed them this. But in essence, what we've got is, the kind of the yellow square here is to do with things which are kind of endurance-y. This this red square here is to do with, blue is to do with endurance. Yellow is to do with kind of power, anaerobic power, and this is kind of to do with strength. So you've kind of got different faces on the Rubik's cube. And so we think about that strength training, that's endurance training, that's flexibility training. The problem is training doesn't work like that. That you don't train one little bit separately from the other little bit. You don't do just endurance training, then just strength training. What we're doing is we're training, even if we're not deliberately going to the gym and lifting weights, by pushing a bigger gear, you're training strength in the muscle. And the issue that you've got is that we start to get interference effects. So for example, training strength reduces the blood flow to the muscle. We actually get a reduction in our capillary density in the muscle. We actually get less capillary. And so it actually has an effect on your kind of economy because you've trained strength. If we train flexibility, what we do by training flexibility, we make somebody more flexible, it reduces your strength. And so you get this kind of clash of these biological responses. And so what you have to think is, well, how do you structure that in terms of training? But also it's recognizing that these biological processes don't all respond at the same rate. So for example, the time frame for which you can recover from a training session, which is say hip-based, is going to probably potentially be longer than it's going to be if you train from an endurance-based training session. But the adaptation from the endurance training session is slower than it will be from the hip-based session. So it's really quite and you start to complicate, you start to have to balance these out in terms of trying to ascertain what it is you want and how you can fit the recovery in and really what it is you're trying to drive. So I think understanding a little bit about the way Rubik's cubes work is actually quite neat in terms of thinking about what I call the interference effect with training. The next one is pyramids. And I think this is really neat, I say so myself, which is trying to say, well, okay, let's think about the different kinds of training. And we've covered most of these this evening already. So what you've got here is, this is a pyramid in the desert. And when you look at a pyramid in the desert, the big pyramids, the big pyramids of Giza, they've got a massive base to them. Otherwise, they'd fall down, right? You can't have a really tall pyramid unless it's got a really big base. The laws of physics mean that the damn thing is going to fall down. Even if you think about kind of the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, it's got a massive base. It just happens to be that massive base is hidden, right? But we can layer into this our training principles, which is one is called volume, which is kind of how often and how long we train for, and the intensity, which is how hard we train for. And what we know is this, is that in order to develop a successful physiological response, whether it's training or just trying to develop us biologically, you need a massive base. It's like building a house. Pyramid is a house. You need a big base. And the big base is developed through aerobic based training. And so I've put it in yellow because this is very much where we talked about in terms of that lactate data. It's that lower intensity training, less than 60% of your Vo2 max. You need that. Everything else is built upon that. All the other adaptations are built upon what goes down here. But the recovery, which is this scale here, between those sessions is quite short. You can do more intense ones, but the recovery becomes slightly longer. We talked a little bit about, with Gary, we talked about the lactate threshold, the lactate turn point. It's quite a small zone, which I mentioned earlier on. So the intensity is higher, but the volume of training that you can do because as the intensity goes up, the volume you can sustain becomes less. You can't sustain as much of this, but you can't get these adaptations unless you've got this firm foundation here. And then all the kind of the stuff which is the hot topic, the interval stuff, is built on top of all of this. So if all you attempt to do is interval training, it's like putting the cherry on the top of the cake. You've got the cherry, but somebody's pinched all your cake. And so you could have all of this interval-based training, but it is like classically building a house on foundations that are falling apart. So if all you ever do is train intervals, all you get are those kind of high intensity adaptations. You haven't got a big volume of work behind you. And it's like building it on really unsustainable foundations. And biologically, we collapse. We can't sustain it. We can't, we can't race well, we can't train well, and so on and so forth. So it becomes a major issue. And just bear in mind this kind of scale here, which is as the intensity of these sessions goes up, the recovery becomes longer. And the take-home message I was saying in terms of training is something, a mantra I kick into my students all the time, is really simple. The purpose of training, I love this, the purpose of training is to stimulate growth, right? That's what we want, adaptation. So the purpose of training is to stimulate growth. That growth only occurs during periods of rest and recovery. You do not adapt during training, you adapt during recovery. So if you compromise the recovery, you compromise your ability to overcome fatigue, you compromise your ability to recover. So that's pyramids. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to show you this last one and then just open up for questions. Is icebergs. And it's like, what the heck? It's like you're having a geography lesson. And why pyramids and icebergs? Well, we've seen the pyramid. Where does the iceberg come in? Well, the iceberg analogy is this. If you look at an iceberg and imagine this blue block here is the surface, and this black line here is kind of the surface of the sea, right? So this is underwater down here. You only ever see this small bit of the iceberg. What you never see is what's going on underneath, which is a huge, vast amount of that iceberg. We never see it. You just see the bit on the top. And the way to think about that in terms of training is the top of the iceberg is competition. It's the competition period in terms of training. It's kind of the only bit that people really see. That's the bit that people focus on. That's the kind of the bit, the glory times, the time trials, or whatever it is you're doing with whatever you're doing. And it's a short block of time. All the hard work takes place below it, which is the preparation period. And just to kind of put it into context for you, what we know, as I put these kind of two arrows here, that the red blocks are signifying for you what we call volume. So you can see that the volume of training is really high in here. So that's lower intensity, higher volume. So that's either more frequent or longer duration training. The intensity is low. But as we start to come out of this kind of preparation, and we're starting to go into maybe your time trial season or whatever it is, or you're trying to race in terms of randonnées or whatever it is, the intensity starts to increase, but the volume has to decrease. You can't sustain both of them. And that produces this kind of iceberg effect where you get this short period. You have to do all this work here, plus this, to just be able to compete. We work on the notion that if it's basically a 2/3 to 1/3 of time. So 2/3 of the time is preparatory training, to 1/3 of your time is competitive. So in a year, you've only probably got 3 months of really good competition in a whole year. You can expand it a little bit, but 3 months of good competition in a whole year, 9 months of preparation training, of which unfortunately there is no silver bullet to this. Is really kind of volume-based training with, yes, intervals thrown in, but it's predominantly volume-based training. Okay, I should probably stop at that point because we're delayed with our start or whatever. And I will just open it up if there are any kind of questions that have come at the end of this from you guys. But I think it's probably the right place to stop. So if you've got any questions, throw them in.
And there's been a lot of talk in recent years about base, and you can only gain on a base with pretty much along what you've said, extra volume. what's the thing for people who are a time crunch? I'm sure lots in the club are busy with families and jobs and everything. How do you develop the best base with the shortest period of time available? I mean, that's
so what you want is the silver bullet, right?
Don't we all?
And actually, that's really where HIIT came from. So HIIT came about because we're in a society now where people are limited for time. We're in a society now. Everything is a 24-hour society. We're working longer. We've got greater pressures. So there was this idea. Well, can we get a bang for our buck by doing high intensity interval training, which does produce adaptations? And is it a quick fix? And the simple truth I'll give you is, yeah, right. As I said earlier on, you can do HIIT, and you will get adaptations. I showed you on the chart, you'll get adaptations, but they're not sustainable. That's the downside. And I would love to be able to say to you that there is a really simple way of doing this. The only simple way that I can recommend, which reduces the volume, is you train as close as possible to the, I've got to find my pointer. You train as close as possible to this kind of lactate turn point, lactate threshold point, because you can reduce the volume. You're still below that magical point, but because because the intensity is higher, the volume becomes less. But on the grand scale of things, it doesn't suddenly mean that you can reduce it down from 6 hours per session to 20 minutes. But you can go from these sessions down here, which are maybe kind of 6 hour long sessions, the classic stuff my old man used to do, to up here where you're going to be doing maybe 2 hour rides, 3 hours tops in this block here, and it's going to develop a base. You're missing out some of the kind of the lower stuff, but you're still going to get a good bang for your buck by training up here. As soon as you go beyond this point, you kind of get into the territory of losing the aerobic base.
Okay, thanks. I mean, training's all about adaptation and progression. Should your base only, is it like most training, you increase volume and increase intensity? But for argument's sake, does base pretty much stay the same year on year as you get older?
No, again, that's a really good question. That you're absolutely right. The key to training is what we call progressive overload. So from any form of training, the key is that you never want to stay in the same place. And so your base training has to kind of increase. And if you just bear with me, if I shoot back through the slides very quickly, and we go to this one here. So let's say that, this year that you've been doing the majority of your base training here at, say, 225 watts. The net result of doing the majority of your training here is that you're going to get these kind of adaptations that are fundamental to base. So what will happen over time is this point here will shift to the right.
Well, nobody's seen that.
So as that shifts to the right, this zone starts to increase. So it means that you've got a greater zone over which you can work, which means you can increase the intensity at which you train at. So fundamentally, assuming we've had a fairly good year of training, however you want to define that, this point shifting to the right means that you've got a bigger zone to work in, which means that although you're training at probably the same relative exercise intensity, you're pushing a bigger wattage. So the net result is that you will continue to gain. If you just train at the same intensity year in, year out, you're never really pushing those kind of biological boundaries.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Dan.
No problem.
Dan, can I ask?
Of course.
I have a coach, and I mean, he doesn't talk to me about junk miles, but you hear when you read the books and you hear things. You do, in terms of polarized training, particularly, you do get this idea of junk miles, and I struggle to get my head around that. And I sort of have a laugh with my mates when we're out on our long rides, and I say, "Well, these are all junk miles, of course." I mean, how much of truth is there in that for people like us, do you think?
I think there's and it is a grain of truth in it. I'll give you the great example. A number of years ago, I was working for UK Athletics at one of their training camps, and one of the coaches was there, and it was kind of a Sunday evening, and it was like 4 o'clock in the winter, and we were all packing up to go home, and this guy, got his kit on, and he said, "Are you going for a run?" Yeah, I'm going for a run. Oh, right. Well, how far are you going? I'm going to run a mile. Well, why? Well, I've run 99 miles this way. I've got to get 100. That's junk miles. Because no matter what you do in that mile, nothing's going to happen biologically that's going to account to anything. So that is junk training. But any training that you do anywhere on this kind of curve is better. So even if you're cycling down here and you're out with your mates and you're doing a gentle cycle, it's contributing to your aerobic base. It's only when you're kind of in this zone here, which we didn't really talk about tonight. This is where you do your recovery training. So if you're doing intervals, you do your recovery training in here. This is not going to produce any biological adaptation, but it is useful if you're kind of recovering from intervals, but you wouldn't go and do your long rides. So you might call that kind of junk mileage. But, if you're kind of down here, and this is low intensity stuff, this is the kind of stuff where if you're riding down here, this kind of intensity, you can go and ride this for 6-7 hours down here. Not junk mileage. It's all going to produce local, small, but it's going to produce adaptations, which in the end, the key with training is kind of a cumulative effect. And that's why, as I was saying earlier on, if all you ever do is train up here, yes, you kind of get these big sudden shock responses, but they're just not sustainable. So I think the grain of truth is if you go and just do small distances, you imagine going to ride your bike for a mile, and I've run a mile, great, and I rode a mile really hard. Yeah, okay, great, you've done it once. Nothing's going to come of that. But if you go and ride, for a long amount of time, just in this zone here, it's building that base, and that will contribute to the development of your kind of sustained aerobic base and your sustained volume.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else? Anybody else?
I've got another question.
Go on, yeah, go for it, Gary.
One of the things I've been told is that the one weakness of cycling for the aging athlete is bone density, because it doesn't really do much for that. And that as you get older, you should do something that impacts on the bones, like running. Do you agree with that? Do you think introducing a little bit of running as you get older is a good thing?
I suppose there's two answers to that. I think what we know is that in an aging population, when people in an aging population take up running, actually they tend to get a lot of injuries because of putting these high impact forces through, particularly the knee and the ankle. And as we saw on that kind of that chart earlier on, you're absolutely right. You start to lose things like bone mineral density, and so the bones become more susceptible. And because the bones become more susceptible to injury, you end up putting more strain through the muscle and the joints. So I'm always slightly cautious of saying, yeah, go and tackle running. The key really is you're trying to prevent a decline in that bone mineral density. And what we understand is fundamentally, as long as you're putting strain through the muscle, through the bone, that will contribute to that delay. And it doesn't have to be impact forces. So one of the things we've started to recognize is as long as there is a force going through the joint, and what we're talking about here is kind of a tension on the bone, that as long as we're applying something to that, it's going to help reduce that kind of bone mineral loss. And so one of the classic ways of doing that is using large gears and pushing a large gear, because you're generating a high force through the muscle. And because the muscle is in essence, what it's doing is it's pulling on the bone, it's going to create some kind of shear stress within the bone. Not to the same degree as you're going to get with running, not at all. But I sometimes think that it's a safer bet to do than something like running, where we see regularly, the older athletes who are just experiencing knee pain and shin pain, and they're getting shin splints and ankle pain because they've come to running. And particularly if you're doing cycling, your muscles are built so differently. The way your mechanics work is so different in a cyclist as it is to a runner, that we find that we get all these kind of muscle pains and these joint aches. And I think perhaps just doing something which is putting a shear stress through the bone, where you're pushing kind of high resistances, or even lifting weights. Actually, I think we often think about gyms as being kind of a sad place to go, or a particularly boring place to go. But actually, the benefits of doing resistance training with quite heavy loads are quite profound, both on kind of cardiovascular fitness, but also on that kind of stress that we're talking about through the bones as well. So I think I would slight caution, I think, in terms of recommending something like running.
Thanks. No, that makes sense.
Cool. Anybody else? Time for probably one more, I would suspect, if anybody's got a burning question.
You mentioned the decrease in immune function in highly trained athletes being similar to people as they get older. Can you explain that slightly more? Is it just a general decrease in antibody and T cell function, or is there anything more behind it? I think.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I mean, what we've seen in the elite athlete is it's a combination of things that drive them to this state. In the elite athlete, it is absolutely to do with a suppression, particularly of things like T cells, and we see quite significant reductions in total immune function. And one of the things that we look at is we use an index which is the upper respiratory tract infection rate, and that is markedly increased in those individuals. And there are a number of reasons which that might be. Is one, we've got this downturn in things like T cells, and actually one of the things that we see is a reduction in things like glutamine as well. And ironically, I think we'd anticipate that glutamine would increase, but actually we see this reduction in glutamine in highly trained athletes, which again has a significant role to play in things like the inflammatory response. And we find this kind of association. I'm always slightly dubious about association, but this association between glutamine concentration and upper respiratory tract infection. And it may be, I mean, the other thing we're looking at, I suppose, is that it may be that in those athletes, they've got very high ventilation rates as well, significantly higher ventilation rates. And that you've got to kind of get this suppression through training in terms of T cell count. And it's suppressed by intensity. And so if you've got an overall raised exercise intensity, that has this knock-on effect on particularly, as I say, on the T cells, has this knock-on effect on glutamine. And if they've got a high ventilation rate, it seems to all kind of coalesce in this increased upper respiratory tract infection rate. And the data on it is quite frightening. When you look at the data from the London Olympics, I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but there was a study published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine that showed, I think it was something like 17%, I think it was 17% of all athletes that arrived at the Olympic Village had some form of immune infection. And that was a very broad term that they'd got. And of that 17%, 5% were so actually ill that they were unable to compete in an Olympic Games. And it is incredible that we see that. And it's, as I say, it's not uncommon. And it's more common in endurance athletes than it is in power athletes or sprint-based athletes.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, I probably suspect that's probably time to wrap it up. It's 9:35. And doesn't seem to be any burning questions, but thanks for hosting me. I will make the video available through YouTube, so I can send a link to Keith. I'll render it and get it up through YouTube, so if other people want to watch the video. I'll hang around if people want to chat for 10 more minutes afterwards. But I think if everybody's happy, we'll call it a night.
Thank you, Dan. That was great.
Thanks, Tim. It was brilliant.
More than
Thank you very
welcome.
much.
Thank you.
Not a problem at all, folks.
Thanks.
Excellent, Dan. Thank you.
You're welcome. And hopefully I'll come up to Birmingham at some point and see you guys all out on your bikes at some point. That'd be rather nice.
That'd be nice, yeah. See you. Bye.
Pleasure. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks, Dan.
Cheers.